Hello and welcome to Design Patterns in C. My name is Ahmed Yusri and this is the second session. During this session we are going to discuss the command pattern and our session will be divided into three parts. First part will be an example of a system that we need to implement. The second part will be a full description of the command pattern and this is the pattern that we are going to use. And the third part will be an implementation of this pattern in C. So let's start with the first part. Our system consists of two components. We have the client or the remote controller and we have the server, which contains four LEDs. If the user presses the button number 1 for a short time, then the three LEDs are going to blink from right to left. If the user presses the button number 1 for a long time, then the three LEDs are going to blink from left to right. If the user presses the button number 2 or the undo button, then we need to unexecute the last request or we need to roll back to the last state. So for example, if we are in the right state and the user presses the button number 1 for a short time, then we are going to the left state. If the user presses the undo button, then we need to roll back to the right state or unexecute the last request. Also, the user will be able to change each button function. So for example, instead of using the button number 2 to perform the undo function, we will use it to select the second mode. So now let's see a real example of our system. So I have created a small application to be able to configure the buttons or to change the buttons configuration. And also we have our small system. So we have here two buttons and four LEDs. If the user presses the first button for a short time, then we are going to enter the left state. If the user presses the first button for a long time, then we are going to enter the right state. If the user presses the undo button, then we need to roll back to the previous state or to unexecute the last request. If the user presses the undo button again, then we are going to enter the idle state. So let's try to reconfigure the buttons. So now instead of using the undo function, we will select the mode number 2. And also we will use the first button to select the first mode. Now let's update the configuration and let's perform a system reset. Now if the user presses the second button, then we are going to enter the right state. If the user presses the first button, then we are going to enter the left state. So let's see how this system could be implemented. But before that, let's go through the command pattern. The main concept behind this pattern is the request encapsulation. So each request will be represented as an object which contains the mandatory information to execute this request. So for example, if the client needs to turn one of the LEDs on, then we could represent this request as a structure. This structure will hold the pin ID and the needed state, and also will reference the execute function, so it could be used by the invoker to execute this request. The command pattern could be divided into three components: the invoker or the interface, which is responsible for interacting with the client, and also the interface or the invoker will reference the needed command to execute the client request. Also, we have the command abstract class, which defines the mandatory methods that shall be implemented by each concrete class. Each command will be represented as a concrete object, which implements the mandatory methods from the command abstract class. And also will contain a private data which define the needed parameters to execute this request. So what we could do with this pattern, for example, the invoker could have a history buffer like this, and if the client needs to execute one of the requests, the invoker will just add the new request ID to this history buffer. So if the client needs to unexecute this request or the last request, then the invoker will just get the last request ID from the buffer and call the undo function to unexecute this request. Also, the invoker could have a log for the last executed requests during the last minute. So if we have a system crash or a shutdown, then we could redo the last requests in sequence, or even we could debug our system. So let's see how we could implement this system in C. We have here the interface header file, which defines the public functions that will be used by the client. So we have the dispatch function, which will be used to execute one of the commands. And also we have the undo function, which will be used to unexecute the last request. So let's see the implementation of these functions. So the dispatch function needs to add the new command to the history and then trigger the execute function using the command object. And the undo function will just get the last command ID from the command history and then trigger the undo function based on the current command object. So let's see the abstract class implementation. And the abstract class will just define the mandatory methods that shall be implemented by each concrete class. Also, we have here an example of one of the concrete classes, system LED command. The first parameter in this class is a reference to the implementation of the abstract class. And then we have the private parameters that will be used to execute this request. So now let's see the implementation of the mandatory methods from the abstract class. So we have here the execute method and the unexecute method. So for example, if the invoker calls the execute method, then the first thing that the execute method needs to do is to memorize the current state. And then it will trigger the server to execute this event or to execute this request. If the invoker trigger the unexecute function, then it will just call the server and ask him to go back to this state or to the last state. The memento is one of the design patterns which used to memorize the object state. We will discuss this pattern in details in the incoming videos, but now let's go and see how the interface will use the command object. The first thing that the interface needs to create the command objects and give them the appropriate parameters. Also, the invoker will have a table or a list which have a reference to each command. So the invoker will uses the command object based on the past ID. The constructor could be a normal function or macro, like this one. So we need to create an object from the system LED command type and give it the reference to the command object and also which event that we need to execute. So for example, if we need to apply the same for the LED example, then we just need to create an object from the LED command class. So LED command construct will be like this. We will call it LED LED1 command, and we need to give it the LED ID and the LED state and the needed state on state. Then we need to have a reference to this object in our table, so it could be used by the invoker when the client needs to execute this function, and so on. Your comments are highly appreciated. Thanks for listening and have a nice day.